What's going on guys, Jin here, and this is a non-Frostnova pit farming fireball build. At final optimized build, it clears tier 100 to 110 pits in around 2 to 3 minutes if you're really going ham on it. The downside of this build is definitely bossing, as for most fireball builds in general, but it decimates hordes of enemies no problem. Don't forget to check out the build planner for variations and the notes for some extra optimizations depending on the content you're attempting with this build. If you like this kind of video, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and leave a comment saying hi. It is very appreciated. Now onto the build. So starting with the skill tree, we're going to take 1 into Firebolt, and 1 into Frostbolt. Then in our core skills, we're going to take 5 into Fireball of course, and we're going to go for Destructive Fireball, and then 1 into Devastation, and 3 into Elemental Dominance. In our defensive skills, we're going to be taking 1 into Flame Shield, 1 into Teleport, and go for Shimmering Teleport, then also 3 into Glass Cannon, 1 into Elemental Attunement, and 1 into Ice Armor, and go for the Shimmering Ice Armor. In our Conjuration skills, we're going to take 1 into Align the Elements, 3 into Mana Shield, 2 into Protection, 3 into Conjuration Mastery, 1 into Lightning Spear, going for the Invoked Lightning Spear, 1 into Ice Blades, and go for the Summoned Ice Blades. In our Mastery skills, we're going to take 3 into Inner Flames, and 3 into Devouring Blaze. Then we come down to our ultimate skills. We're taking 1 into Permafrost, and 3 into Hoarfrost, 1 into Fiery Surge to get the 3 into Soulfire, and then 1 into Coursing Current, and 3 into Electrocution. And last but not least, in our key passives, we're going to take Esu's Ferocity here. Next up, we have the Paragon Board. So for the starting board here, we're going to go with Tactician, pretty standard. We deal 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill, and this duration is increased by 4 seconds for each defensive skill not on our action bar. For our second board here, we're going to go for the Enchantment Master board, and we're putting in the Elementalist glyph. So dealing fire, cold or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage we deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking up to once per element. For our third board here, we're going for the Searing Heat board, making sure we take the legendary node so our pyromancy skills have a 12% increased critical strike chance, and deal increased direct damage equal to 20% of our damage with fire bonus up to 60%. And we're going to put in the Pyromaniac glyph here. So every pyromancy skill we cast increases our fire damage by 2% for 6 seconds up to 10%. For our fourth board, we're going to go for the Burning Instinct board, and we're going to put in the Destruction glyph for that critical strike damage, and critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds up to 12%. For our fifth board, we're going to go for Ceaseless Conduit, and we're going to put in the Exploit glyph, so that's going to give us a lot of vulnerable damage. Also, dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases our damage by 1% for 6 seconds, up to 10%. For our sixth board, we're going to go for the Frigid Fate board, making sure to take the legendary node, so we deal bonus damage to vulnerable enemies equal to 20% of the total damage with cold, up to a maximum of 60%. And we're going to put in the Flame Feeder glyph here, so damage to burning enemies, and we deal 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies. For our seventh and final board, we're going for the Static Surge board, and we're going to put in the Control glyph, so we deal extra damage to CC'd enemies. Also, we deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled, or 20% to stunned or frozen. So pretty straightforward here. All of this is going to be in the planner in the description below. That's going to include the gear, Paragon board, skill tree, and the enchantments as well, and anything else related to the build. Next up, we have the Enchantments. For the Enchantments, pretty straightforward. We're using the Firebolt enchantment as our first one, so direct damage from skills applies burning damage over 8 seconds. And secondly, our Frostbolt enchantment, so direct damage from skills applies up to 18% chill. So this is what we're going to use to activate our Hoarfrost, as well as parts of our control glyph. And as for the Firebolt enchantment, we're going to be using that to proc our Devouring Blaze, as well as our Flame Feeder glyph. Next up we have the gear. So for the gear, on the left I'm going to list the affixes and the tempering you want to get. So let's start with the Helm. We're going to go for the Godslayer crown here. So that's going to give us all stats, max life, damage to elites, and cooldown reduction. And also when you stun, freeze or immobilize an elite, you pull in all nearby enemies and deal 30 to 60% increased damage for 3 seconds. And that occurs once every 12 seconds. And against bosses, this effect will trigger whenever we deal damage. So we want to masterwork the cooldown reduction on this, and if you don't have a Godslayer crown, you're going to want to use a normal helm with intelligence, cooldown reduction, and max life. And you would want to temper that with ranks into warmth and lucky hit percent chance to immobilize. As for the aspect, you would want to go with concentration, and that's going to let you get 15 to 25% damage reduction for 5 seconds when you cast a conjuration skill. And as for the masterworking, you would also masterwork the cooldown reduction. Next up we have the chest piece. We're just going to go for a normal chest piece here, looking for something with intelligence, armor, and ranks into defensive skills. And you would want to temper that with ranks into warmth and lucky hit percent chance to freeze. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the defensive skills. And for the aspect, we're going to go with Everliving, so we take 10 to 25% less damage from CC'd or vulnerable enemies. Next up we have the gloves. We're going to go for gloves of the Illuminator here. These are mandatory for the build. Wouldn't recommend doing this build without these gloves. So that's going to give us some crit strike chance, fireball attack speed, some mana when fireball explodes, and ranks into fireball. So the unique aspect is what makes these gloves so good. Fireball will bounce as it travels, exploding each time it hits the ground, and the explosion deals 30 to 0% less damage. Obviously you want to try and get closer to the 0%. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the ranks into fireball. So these gloves aren't too hard to get, wouldn't recommend doing this build seriously without these gloves. Next up we have the pants. We're going to go for Tybalt's Will here. That's going to give us all stats, max life, max resource, and damage reduction whilst unstoppable. We also deal 10 to 20% increased damage whilst unstoppable and for 5 seconds after. And that will allow us to gain primary resource when we become unstoppable as well. As for the masterworking, we would want to try and masterwork the max life here. And if you don't have access to Tybalt's Will, then you would want to use some pants with intelligence, max life, and armor. And you would temper that with ranks into warmth and lucky hit percent chance to slow. As for the masterworking, you would masterwork the intelligence. And for the aspect, you would want to use the aspect of Snowveiled, so casting ice armor makes you unstoppable and grants you 25% damage reduction for 3.5 to 5 seconds. Next up we have the boots. We're going to go for Esu's Heirloom here. That gives us movement speed after killing an elite, crit strike damage, and resist all. Also, our crit strike chance is increased by 20 to 40% of our movement speed bonus. And we want to try and masterwork the crit strike damage. If you don't have Esu's Heirloom, you would use boots with intelligence, max life, or armor, depending on what you're lacking here, making sure we hit the armor cap of 9,230, and then we want to get move speed. As for the tempering, we're going to temper that with teleport cooldown reduction and crowd control duration. And as for the aspect, you would want to use the aspect of Concussive Strikes, so damaging an enemy has up to 20% chance to daze them for 2 seconds on lucky hit, and you deal 5 to 20% increased damage to dazed enemies. Next up we have the weapon, and again, just like the gloves, wouldn't recommend doing this build without the staff we have here. So we're going to go for the Staff of Endless Rage. That's going to give us intelligence, fireball projectile speed, chance for fireball projectiles to cast twice, and ranks into fireball. And also, the unique aspect, every third cast of Fireball launches 2 additional projectiles and deals 50 to 90% increased damage. So we're going to want to masterwork the ranks into Fireball here. Pretty straightforward. Again, wouldn't recommend this build without this weapon. And next up we have the Amulet. We're going to go for an Amulet with crit chance, ranks into Inner Flames, and ranks into Devouring Blaze. As for the tempering, we're going to temper that with Pyro critical strike damage and Lightning Spear cooldown reduction if possible. As for the aspect, we're going to go for the aspect of 3 curses, so that will increase the critical strike damage of Meteor and Fireball by 38 to 60%, double this bonus against healthy targets. And as for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the ranks into Devouring Blaze. Next up we have the rings. We're going to go for Talrash's Iridescent Loop as our first one. That gives us lucky hit chance, non-physical damage, cooldown reduction, and ranks into Potent Warding. Also, for each type of elemental damage we deal, gain 10 to 20% increased damage for 4 seconds, up to 40 to 80%, and dealing any elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the cooldown reduction here. For our second ring, we're going to go with a normal ring with intelligence, attack speed, and critical strike chance, and we're going to temper that with critical strike damage, preferably Pyro critical strike damage, and Lightning Spear cooldown reduction. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the attack speed, and for the aspect, we're going to use the aspect of Shredding Blades. So Ice Blade's chance to apply vulnerable is increased by 20%, and the vulnerable duration is increased by 4 seconds. Also, you gain 15 to 30% vulnerable damage. If you don't have access to a Talrash's Iridescent Loop, you would use a duplicate of the second ring, but for the aspect, you would use Conceited, so you deal 10 to 25% increased damage while you have a barrier active. As for the gems, we're going to be using the skulls in the jewellery for that extra armor. We're going to be using the emeralds in the weapon for the extra critical strike damage. And we're going to be using the rubies in the armor for the maximum life. That pretty much wraps up this build. Again, you don't want to attempt making this build without the gloves of the Illuminator and the Staff of Endless Rage. So I hope you enjoyed. Hope this build helps you out a lot. If you made it this far, please consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell, and leaving a comment down below, as it helps out the channel a lot and it would be much appreciated. So I'm going to leave you with some Fireball action. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!